So I'd like to welcome to the stage Karim Musa, Senior VP E-Mobility Siemens Middle East. Dr. Andy Piepenbrink, CEO of Hager Energy. Mr. Rasso Bartenschlager, GM of Al Masaood Power Division. Mr. Peter Rolton, Executive Chairman at British Volt. And Mr. Stephen Severance, Head of Program Management and Investment at Masdar City. Am I? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So while we wait for Stephen, what about we start by introducing ourselves? Would you like to start?
Sure. Just checking if you can hear me. Great. So my name is Karim Musa, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Siemens Electric Mobility in the Middle East. We're not new to the electric mobility field. One of the first ever electric cars had a Siemens motor on it. This was nearly 80 years ago. Today we're much more active on the electric vehicle infrastructure side, on developing a network of EV infrastructure in the region and providing the right kind of technology for network providers and those that wish to build up their EV charging infrastructure.
Thank you, Karim. Andy?
Yeah, I'm out of automotive and semiconductors industry, and I'm now running a company for PV storage and charging in Germany called E3DC, and I'm a vice president in Hager Group, and Hager is a, let's say, mid-sized player in electric infrastructure.
Looking forward to see how we can integrate all these solutions, PV, storage, EVs.
That's my job.
Rasso?
My name is Rasso Bartenschlager. I'm the general manager of the Al Masaood Power Division. It's a part of the Al Masaood Group, and we are basically into energy supply, mobile energy, as well as backup generators. And now EV is for us a big story, I would say, because we are part of the problem with selling diesel and petrol engines. But now we are looking into the charging and the independent charging, so there could be in between places where there is no grid connection.
Thank you.
Peter Rolton, Executive Chairman of British Volt. British Volt is a battery cell manufacturer. We're looking to produce best-in-class batteries across a whole range of different applications, ranging from light commercials right through to sports cars, onwards into static storage and even into vertical takeoff and eventually aerospace. So all forms of energy storage as part of the next green revolution.
Hi, Steve Severance, Head of Program Management and Marketing at Masdar City. And Masdar City has been a pioneer of innovation and electric transportation as well as autonomous transportation in Abu Dhabi for almost the past 15 years. And it's so important to us as an urban development because for two reasons. One, surface transportation accounts for about 14% of total carbon output around the world. In advanced economies, US and Europe, 25 to 30%, and we're probably similar in Abu Dhabi. And the way you get around a city is so important to your quality of life. So both in public transportation and in being able to use clean transportation around Masdar, that's why we're here and it's why it's been so important to us since the inception. And glad to have one of our oldest partners, Siemens, on the panel with us.
Absolutely. Pleasure to see you again, Steve.
Thank you, Stephen. Actually, let's start with Masdar as a use case. Can you give us an overview of the population, the type of buildings, and how do you foresee that the charging infrastructure in such a city would look like? Who would pay for it? This way we could give an overview before we drill down into some more detail.
Well, and I think I can talk about where we are now and where we want to get to be. So currently we have about 3,000 people living and about 6,000 or 7,000 people working at Masdar City. We're going eventually to 50,000 people working and 40,000 people living at Masdar City sometime, call it 2035, rough time frame, but less focused on actual completion and more focused on the quality of what we're doing along the way. So when we started with the first electric vehicles in Abu Dhabi in 2009, we brought in 12 Mitsubishi MEIV. It was like a golf cart with doors. Nothing personal to Mitsubishi if they're here, but they weren't ready for the climate and they weren't ready for the driving conditions, as all the manufacturers weren't. And when you look outside here, I think what we've seen change in terms of service offering has been fantastic. So we started putting in charging stations at that time. Mazda installed, paid for, and provided electricity for free. We currently have about 30 standard Type 2 charging stations that are suitable for all vehicles. Mostly those are used for our own fleet right now, as well as for people who live and work at Mazda who primarily own Teslas. Tesla did change. Shout out to Elon Musk, because you have to mention him on every panel, but they really did change the perception of electric vehicles globally. And so the very first superchargers in Abu Dhabi were Tesla superchargers were installed by Tesla. They've now installed 4 more. We are the largest Tesla supercharger location in the UAE, which we're very proud of that partnership. We have a partnership with Tesla for car sharing. You can come and download an app from eCar and rent a Tesla by the minute. So currently, the Type 2 chargers we're providing for free. The mall, Masjid Al Futtaim Mall, provides another 9 chargers at their location, which, much like all other malls, you charge for free. And Tesla, currently, you're charging for free. This is kind of a spectacular time to buy an electric vehicle in the UAE with all of the free charging and with the price of petrol going up to about $1 a liter. So the economics have never been better around owning an electric vehicle. I think at some point now we're starting to see charging companies come into Abu Dhabi and charge for that, install and say, okay, we're going to charge for that. And when you look at the backup at the Tesla chargers at Mazda sometimes, absolutely there'd be times when people would say, yes, we'd pay for that in order to avoid the wait. Dubai regulations do not allow that yet, but I hope that hopefully that will change. But I see it going forward in those 3 ways. You're going to have the real estate developers be able to recover their costs. So if you live in an apartment building, you might install a slow charger, and that will be billed directly to you into your apartment. If you are at office building, most likely the building owner will wind up covering that cost, and then Tesla or other manufacturers will put up specialty stations and either pay for those, or in order to encourage use of their vehicles, or there'll be some charge at some point.
Do they have chargers at home, those Tesla owners?
Do they have them at home?
Chargers at home.
Most likely they do. A lot of times, look, we are on the way to Dubai. So if you've come in from Dubai, or if you're heading out, or if you've come back and forth from Dubai, you need a quick charge and a coffee, this is a good place to do it.
Okay, thank you. So it seems like everywhere a mix of slow residential chargers and some high-powered fast chargers.
Yes.
So moving now to installing this charging infrastructure on the grid. Are we preparing our grid for this infrastructure and for the impact that electric vehicles will have on? Maybe you start with you, Karim.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So I think the discussion on the grid has always been, let's say, revolving around the grid being an independent and isolated element of the power system. And as a result, the focus has always been, the challenges with the grid, and is the grid ready for electric vehicles? And actually, what I like to highlight is, going forward, there's going to be 6 layers that are going to be connected that don't exist today, right? So with electric vehicles and inherently digital electric vehicle charging infrastructure, you have the 6 dimensions, right? So you have the drivers, you've got the vehicles, you've got the chargers, you've got the buildings, and then you have the grid edge, and then you have the grid, right? So the grid edge and the grid are just one portion of a very big system of interconnected elements. And going forward, we need to be able to utilize these elements to their maximum capability. So today, we're looking at the grid as a completely isolated element. And also, we're not really connected to our mode of transport, right? So there's, when you wake up in the morning or when you go to your petrol station, there's barely any sort of digital connection between the two, right? But now we're starting to talk about buildings that can communicate with the chargers that are sitting outside them, right? So, for example, when there's a high element of air conditioning usage inside a building, then the building could basically speak to the chargers and sort of optimize energy usage and say, hey, look, we've got this limit of 100 kilowatts. I need you to only use 20 kilowatts so I can use the remaining 80 kilowatts. Right? And this is an example of an interconnection that doesn't exist today that will exist in the future. So it's no longer just about the challenges. I think from a grid perspective, the number one topic is where will we get the power from, right? So if we convert all the cars to electric today, we're going to have a grid challenge. Well, of course. But let's look at the opportunities as well, right? So you can power electric vehicles using wind, using solar, using hydro. However, for internal combustion engines, you have only one fuel, or two, right? So you've got petrol and diesel, and neither is renewable, right? Both are combustible. So look at the opportunity that the grid brings to electric vehicles, right? So I'm able to translate the power of the sun and convert it into my car. So yes, it does pose a challenge for the grid, but that's definitely another opportunity. There's another key opportunity that we need to talk about when it comes to the grid, and it's the consumer empowerment. So as a driver today, given the right regulation climate, I'm able to install solar panels on my roof, right? So I'm able to generate my own power and pump it into my vehicle, right? So I wake up every morning with 100% power generated from the sun because I did that myself. So the only equivalent in today's world is if you own a petrol pump or an oil refinery in your backyard, which I'm willing to bet nobody here does. So the consumer empowerment that the grid, and here we're specifically talking about the decentralized energy systems on the grid, they're able to provide a lot of advantages. And I think the last part would be the vehicle-to-grid technology. So today the flow of power is unidirectional. Sorry, it's one directional, right? So you've got the power flowing from the grid to the vehicle. But in the very near future, and at Siemens we're already developing our chargers to handle this kind of bidirectional flow, we're getting vehicle-to-grid technology, which allows vehicles to send power back to the grid or to your household. And you know, we can sit for days and talk about the advantages of this, right? Being able to consume a certain amount of power from your vehicle instead of the grid when it's peak, or let's say when electricity is particularly expensive from the grid, emergency power. Think about bus depots. They become these, you know, we convert them from today's big diesel smelling bus stations into future green mobility hubs, right? And you've got essentially moving power centers in these buses, and once they're all parked at night, you've got this massive sort of power availability that's available from your transport mode that you can pump back into the grid. And all of these are being developed. I mean, a lot of these are being piloted as we speak, so we're not necessarily talking about the distant future. We're talking about very near or medium-term future, yep. Right? And it's a matter of standards and let's say regulation.
We showed 58 of them in the UK doing exactly what you described.
There you go.
Thank you.
So yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you. Anyone would like to comment on the grid impact?
From my side, I think as you know, one of the problems, but in the end, I also look at it as a consumer, and I think the problem right now with the grid is not ready. I mean, if we talk about vehicle to grid, if we talk about charging with solar, there's so many parameters. I think this whole problem is much more complex than it sounds like. However, I think there are a lot of steps towards it. If you talk about smart cities, and I think Siemens is very strong in going there, which needs to be sorted out on a very high level if you talk about municipalities, governments, whatsoever. But I think right now, in the moment, what we can do, I think there are a lot of initiatives right now, and solar was one of them mentioned here. I mean, this is grid independent or supporting the grid. Certain grids are not ready in terms of capacity, certain grids are not available, right? So I think grid is not ready, but I think it's very quick where we can get to the point where the grid is accepting e-vehicles as a value or as a volume in the streets.
Thank you.
Miriam, maybe I can comment. We have to differentiate between the distribution grid and the other ones. And within the distribution grid, you can resolve many issues by load management or in the ecosystem, single or multi-family home. But first, it's true, the grid is not intelligent. Yeah? And if you see Germany, yeah, we do not even have a smart meter, yeah? But the ecosystem, building and charging works in terms of load management. Yeah? So,
on the house level.
And even if the power consumption doubles, we will not break together. And yeah, what should I say? I don't believe in the super grid and the super communication which enables us to start that business. It's more a decentral thing in the distribution grid. And there is another thing which is maybe a public topic.
Start at home.
And the last comment, it's not about renewable energy. First of all, the electric car is 4 times more efficient than the fueled one. And so it doesn't really matter how you start electric charging. Yeah? Renewable is the best, of course, but you can also do it in a coal
and you still save
grid.
You still save on emissions.
Yes.
Thank you. Peter?
I think if we're going to talk about grid, it's actually a multi-layered issue and problem, and you're quite right, sir, it's not ready. You've got to talk about things like tariff structures as well. The tariff structures need to actually be based around supply and demand, not just things like time of day as they are at the moment. When you've got excesses of energy available from wind and solar, you need to be able to, proactively activate load generation, which could be charging electric vehicles. And of course, what you see when you see pictures of chargers is you see places where chargers can be installed. And in a lot of places, if you start adding the sort of capacity of chargers that we're talking about, for high-performance vehicles, where it's I think there's now 150 and 300 kVA chargers. You don't need to install many of those for the local grid to start and, fall over and have problems. So then, of course, you're into things like static storage, and the need to have static storage embedded within the grid as well, and the ability to actually charge, discharge, and have a properly integrated, joined-up network that actually thinks for itself around load profiles, but also the most important way to make this happen is got to drive consumer behavior. And the best way to drive consumer behavior is make it work in their pocket. That's the easiest way. If it makes good economic sense because you've got the right tariff structure sat behind it, the rest will generally sort of take care of itself. But there are a couple of other sort of unintended consequences here. You mentioned on your slides earlier heat pumps, particularly in the UK, where we're going to effectively ban the gas boiler and move to heat pumps. That's another electrical load on the same infrastructure that wasn't designed for EV charging, certainly wasn't designed for a heat pump. We're going to put both of those onto the local grid. So you've got this huge energy shift away from fossil fuel gas, fossil fuel petrol and diesel onto the infrastructure, which at the best of times is pretty creaky in certain places. So there are, I think, some very, very significant challenges. The cars and the chargers will probably pretty much look after themselves because the amount of investment the manufacturers will put into that. But the grid infrastructure place really needs a lot of good strategic thinking at governmental level to really get behind the idea of how you regulate and incentivize users, how you tax it, and how you make sure you've got the right strategy at national and local grid level to really get this sorted out. And again, drive it also through things like planning policy and building regulations.
Thank you, Peter. Staying with you, we talked about impact on the grid, but what about the impact on the batteries from maybe helping the grid? And tell us maybe a bit more about the battery technology. Are they ready to do charging, discharging? Are they ready to do high power charging, like 350 kilowatt chargers, for example?
So the battery, I think what we have to remember here is that the internal combustion engine is like end-of-life technology, really. It's been around for over 100 years. Current technology is chasing the laws of diminishing returns with it. EV technology is really at the start of the journey. The first Nissan Leaf was 70 miles, then it's 200, then it's 250. The sort of projections that the battery chemists in BV are giving me tell me that we should be looking at 500 miles in the family hatchback by the end of this decade. Now, when you've got that level of range, and it's sort of comparable to everyone always trots out the Volkswagen Golf diesel as a comparative for some reason. But once you've got that on your drive, a lot of the stress around charging will actually then start to back off and change. But again, with the batteries, this next generation of batteries of which we're working, all the manufacturers are working on, we're seeing a move now to much more rapid discharge and energy replacement through things like continuous tabbing on anode and cathode. And so it will go on. I said to someone today, you walk around this show in 20 years' time, it's going to look probably a little bit like a museum compared to where things are going to go, because the pace of change and the investment that's being put in now to new cell formats will have solid state probably in a few years' time as well, and so on and so on. So, we're going to see a very, very rapid, I think, sort of step gearing up through battery technology, such that some of the problems we think about now will actually be history in a few years' time.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Let's go back a bit on the grid side. Andy, what I will ask you is actually a crash course on bidirectional charging, but I'll explain a bit. So what are the components required for a car to do bidirectional charging? That being what we need to change inside the car, outside the car. What are some of the challenges? I can think of cost, it's expensive, but also the opportunities. Karim already mentioned some of them. Are there already car companies who have bidirectional charging using ISO 15118-20?
Yeah.
And you can share slides if you want.
No.
No? Okay.
So in general, it's easy because at the end of the day, every car can do it with a slight modification of the BMS, because it's also a safety and communication issue. But in general, you can discharge the battery like you charge it. So technically, every car will be able to do it. And in Germany, Volkswagen, BMW, and Daimler, they are before launch. So they are preparing the launch.
For the bidirectional?
For the bidirectional, of course, because it's a use case and a value-added service to their charging idea.
And they're not worried about the batteries?
No, I mean, in general, if you have a large battery and if you do, let's say, small or medium cycling, it doesn't harm the battery. Yeah?
No? Happy with that, Peter?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, sorry. Sorry.
No, so I think the one thing I would add here is we need to talk. We talked a lot about technology, but regulatory environment is so important. I mean, you mentioned true supply and demand pricing. But Miriam, I mean, I was fascinated in your presentation that when you hit the pocketbook, that you were actually get about 10,000 miles a year for free, based on vehicle to grid and being smart about when you charge and smart about when you discharge. That's a pretty insignificant incentive structure for anybody to go electric.
That's the proposed business case. However, we have to caveat that by saying we were introducing a new technology. We wanted people to try it. If everyone has electric vehicles now, I don't think we might get those.
Yeah. You mentioned $1 a litre. It's $5 in the UK.
I live here.
The financial case is overwhelming in the UK.
I'm not used to the $1 a litre. I'm used to 35 cents a litre.
Andy, would you like to, we were talking about BMS.
No, I want to say a fundamental thing. The car battery has not so much cycles to have a building or residential or multi-flat usage. So the ESS batteries, they are 5 to 10 times better in cycles because they are not optimized to energy density. Yeah? So in general, a car battery is not so much suitable to have a full year home storage application, but it works. And the last thing what I wanted to say is you need just power electronics to adapt the car battery DC side to the grid, but this is not yet standard, but it's a slight modification to solar inverters or battery inverters, and it will come. And there is another trend, the automotive guys, they also are now thinking to integrate the bidirectional charging hardware into the car as a second branch, which is possible. Into the car, it costs weight, but it's also a way to prevent the ecosystem. I mean, it's a business, Miriam, yeah? So a car manufacturer has to think how he can differentiate and how he can bring value to its customers, and to have one unique car interface, I do not believe it, yeah? So everybody will invent something to keep its customers.
Yeah. You think it introduces complications on grid codes? Like if you're now your car is a generator by itself and not the charger, you probably have a headache of making sure whatever you put in there is certified, etc. And applications that I mentioned, like because we installed V2G chargers and they are considered as generation, we had to apply to install them.
It's a big hurdle, and status quo is that the grid code and the certifications are complicated, but there is a new initiative to make it easier. And so what we have now will not be what we have in the future. It will be easier. And it's also a big fight between the utilities and the OEMs, because the OEMs are not the best friends of the utilities in the future, in general.
We talked a bit about the ISO 15118 and other communication protocols that allow this. Does the panel think we need to legislate these protocols, or do we leave it to the market to decide which protocols to implement in their cars and their chargers? Yeah, who wants to go first?
I mean, look, from my side, I think a sense of standardization is a must, especially when we're talking about things like a vehicle-to-grid system that is going to interface with a microgrid, with a decentralized grid, or with a vehicle. You need some sort of standard to allow the likes of Siemens, right, to be able to take a specific technology and develop it further and integrate that standard into our technologies. I cannot imagine if each manufacturer or each utility wanted to develop their own standard, how difficult this would make it for the rest of us in the ecosystem, right? So I think the standardization process is necessary. I do agree that on the OEM side, on the vehicle side, everyone is going to want to have a bit of their own unique, let's say, selling edge. So that would be normal, but at least on the interface between the vehicle and the grid, or the vehicle and the charger, you would need some sort of very rigid standard to ensure that this technology can be developed and can be grown.
Yeah.
I have to agree on that completely. There's a strong role for the regulatory players here. I mean, even if you get it at a regional level, like you still have a global plug problem. It'd be nice if you went to a single global plug everywhere you traveled, but at least everywhere in a certain region, you're at the same place. You can plug anything in. If you look at things like cell phones, I think we're a lot better off with one type of charger than we are with we're down to two. We're down to two. Yeah. And now, and finally, it's going to be the Europeans going to make Apple come along and play with everybody else. I think that's going to be great for consumers. It's going to be great I mean, we all have cell phones without that, but it's going to be great for adoption of everything you can do to simplify it. The regulatory environment needs to come in and simplify that.
I think from a user's point of view, it's very important. Because if I have a vehicle today and I have to look for a charging station where I can plug in, I think that's taking off the inconvenience, right? Or it's inconvenient as such. And I mean, if you talk about municipalities, whoever provides electricity, I mean, smart grid is going back to very broad, problems here. But the smart grid is coming, but it only works if you have a connectivity where you can overall communicate with, right?
Yeah.
I think we can also say, though, that look, smart grid is coming. We're going to need this. But we can significantly increase the amount of electric vehicles without it still.
Yeah.
I mean, only one country on earth has done a great job at introducing electric vehicles. And they've managed, I'm not sure how much work they need to do on their grid. I'm sure Norway has done work on the grid. But the rest of the countries have gone from 0.5% to 1% to 3 to 5 to 6% to 7%. No one else is over 10% sales. But without making all these changes that we need to make eventually, but we could all get more electric vehicles on the road now. Without significant grid changes.
And they've driven it through consumer behaviour with car taxation on the sales tax. It's made it overwhelmingly compelling to own an electric vehicle in Norway.
What about then that charging infrastructure? Who is expected to pay for it when the business case doesn't make sense?
Well, I think the actual main infrastructure that has to be for government. I think, if you leave that for the private sector, it'll end up coming very fragmented, and you end up with different chargers and different cables and different networks and different, already in the UK, if you drive around an electric vehicle, you probably need half a dozen different apps on your phone, each of ones with your different personal details and all your credit card details, just to use a plethora of different chargers that are currently sat at, service stations. But the grid has to be a national issue, as has the infrastructure that sits behind it. I mean, one of the main problems certainly in the UK is you've got national grid, local district network operators, and they're separated from energy companies. that are actually then trying to sell the power. So really, you do need some you need some proper joined up thinking here if we're actually serious about trying to do this sort of green transition. The danger is it just ends up getting very fragmented and it gets driven backwards from the point of sale. So if the point of sale is what's controlling the behaviours, it's what's controlling what gets installed, it's what's, how things are charged for, that to me is all back to front. Actually, you've got to start the generation piece. And as we're basically turning off fossil fuel assets, we're switching off all this spinning reserve. We put nature in the driving seat in terms of energy generation with wind and solar. You've got to start there, then look at your grid infrastructure, look at how you're going to buffer it, how you're actually then going to balance your loads out, and then go forward into tariff structure, forwards into smart grid, forwards into load generation, and how you're then going to interface that with the customers. But it needs to be top down. I think at the moment what we're seeing is the exact opposite of that. We're seeing bottom up, being driven by the purchase of electric vehicles, driven by chargers, which is lovely, but to me, it's all back to front.
Okay. Well, you started by saying government would pay for it. I would say maybe a hybrid approach where the business case doesn't make sense, then you'd have some local funds. And the fragmented infrastructure is a very good point, and I think this is where those standards we spoke about ensure that if you are going into business, implement that standard so that when we're exchanging data, we are all exchanging in the same format.
Miriam, maybe a practical example because it's a bit theoretic. Germany installed 1 million chargers last year and 970,000 are private chargers. So you pay because you have a home and a car and the car is parking. So it's not governmental business case. And the public chargers, DC charging, these are 99% privately owned utilities or investors, so it's not a governmental issue for Germany.
Okay.
And this is fact. And I think nothing is really intelligent communication to the grid.
And look, I think just to add to that, I think the end game, especially for the Middle East, has to be that the private sector takes over. I think what the government is doing today is excellent. It's very positive, right? And they're solving the chicken and egg problem. What comes first, the vehicles or the infrastructure, right? And as a result, we've seen governments, particularly in the GCC, invest very heavily in the infrastructure side. But now you've come to a crossroads, right? And they're stuck on whether they need to keep investing or whether they hand it over to the private sector. And I think already as we speak in some of the cities not too far from here, there's regulation being discussed. The private sector needs to be stimulated. I think if you have the right regulation, if you have the right sort of tariff models that the private sector can charge, you'll find them really flocking to install EV chargers. I cannot tell you how many private investors we've spoken to, and they have the one major problem is that they're not able to either charge the customers for their kilowatt hour consumption at the charging station, or they're unable to put the right tariff for the return on investment. So I think this is more of a regulatory issue. So despite the government's really putting their weight behind it and doing the right thing at this stage, which is investing in the infrastructure, I think some attention needs to be paid into how you bring the private sector in to take your place.
Following on investing in infrastructure, question for all the panel. Do you think we can localize the EV charging manufacturing industry here in the region? What do we need to make that happen? What could be the barriers preventing that from happening? Do we always need to buy those chargers from companies abroad?
Well, I'm from Siemens, so... but look,
well, you can start maybe.
Yeah. Look, I think the case that needs to be made for local manufacturing, it shouldn't be just local manufacturing for the case of local manufacturing, right? There needs to be a commercial and a technical, let's say, backing behind it, right? And what I mean by that is what we've seen, particularly in the Middle East. The manufacturing topic for EV chargers has risen out of I would say projects, right? So a lot of the projects that get awarded by a government, right? So mega projects, the government would award the project and then they would put as one of the conditions that by winning this project, you have to manufacture your chargers in our country. Now this, I think, creates a short-term, let's say, positive return, right? Because what you end up having is a factory that's able to deliver or specifically built to deliver components for a project, always with the vision of beyond the project, we're going to go forward and we're going to be developing our product, etc. But what we've seen is they tend to always deploy what is called an SKD or CKD system, where it's semi-knockdown or complete knockdown system. So what happens is they end up buying the components, assembling them, and then selling them out. And as a result, you end up having actually a more expensive charger than if you were to buy it from abroad. So this creates, in my opinion, a very short-term benefit, which would not be sustainable. And someone needs to actually make the convincing case that it's better to spend more money on a charger that's manufactured locally than abroad. Now, again, this, of course, does not mean that we don't focus on manufacturing locally. And here, again, we come back to private sector incentives. We need to create the case for these companies and for these investors to come in and actually want to manufacture, not for a specific project, but because of a vision. And then, you know, there's one very key element, which is the technical side, the technological side. So at Siemens, we spend 5.5 billion euros a year on research and development.
Yeah.
Right? And this goes into improving products, into modernizing them, into continuously updating standards. We have software teams sitting behind the chargers, making sure the firmware is updated as the vehicle firmware is upgraded. So for a local manufacturing to let's say, take this seriously, they need to have a similar setup to compete with the global market and not just deliver for one project.
Yeah. Yesterday, the NEV investment Chinese presentation also mentioned they're doing this year. So I'm wondering how it's going to play out with what I think right now is different ways of doing things, specifically with the communication protocol. So it'll be interesting how things will be decided here. Anyone else would like to comment?
Yeah, I would. As Master City, and I have to agree with Siemens. If Siemens came to me and said, hey, we have a choice of doing the design and the thinking around smart grid and around vehicle charging and bringing in the center of excellence for that design or a manufacturing plant, it's not close. I don't see manufacturing EV chargers as such a high value activity that we'd even care where they're done. Like we don't really care where your cell phone's made. Even though if someone makes a lot of money, someone makes some money selling them, I'd much rather have the front-end engineering, the smart grid design, the charger design, the software engineers at Masaood City. Yes. Sorry, if you're thinking where to put them, Kareem, Masaood City. But I'd rather have that part of the value chain at Masaood City than the manufacturing of it.
Great, thank you.
I think for the local industry or for the local business here, the opportunity is not the charger itself. It's around the charger. I mean, you talk about now solar on private homes, the integration of solar, installing these battery chargers, maintaining the battery chargers, and so on, the diagnostics. That's more the opportunity for the local business than just manufacturing a charger.
Thank you. Yeah. I'd like to open up the floor for questions from the attendants. Anyone have questions for our panelists? Maybe you need to use the microphone just behind you.
Hi there, Natasha Tarak from CNBC. This one is for Steve or for anyone who wants to respond. I am curious about how you see the regulatory environment forming in the UAE specifically. So far, do you see fragmentation within the GCC, or do you see something going in a uniform direction? Because when I speak to people in private industry here, they seem a little bit frustrated by lack of communication or uniform strategy on the part of the government, and that they do need a willingness, obviously on the part of the state, to get this going. So where do you see that going? Are you optimistic, or does there need to be more of a push? Thank you.
Sharon, I'll take that first, and would happy to have other people jump in. I think we need more of a push to have a more uniform push across the GCC. Even if you look at Abu Dhabi and Dubai, what they've done in terms of encouraging electric vehicles. Abu Dhabi, it's easy for the private sector to come in and set up charging stations, but you need also a separate meter, and there are other, they have not provided some of the same incentives that Dubai has around free registration, free SALIC for a year, free parking, and so Dubai is taking a different approach, and DEWA owns all of the charging stations in Dubai, and has gone heavy in installing them. Abu Dhabi is taking a more, let's let the private sector come in a bit more here. So I think even in the UAE, a bigger push toward uniformity would be good. Actually, I think a bigger push toward electric vehicles and electrification of the fleet in the region is needed. There's been a tremendous leadership around renewable energy locally, and in terms of both the installation, but also the pricing and world record pricing multiple times, done by UAE company, done by local, regional companies, not just Masaood, but others as well. And that's been a really successful push, and I think we need something, and that came with a lot of government direction. And I think we need something similar to that in terms of the electrification of the fleet as well.
And I mean, from my side, I agree with Stephen here. And to answer your question directly, I'd say we're rather very optimistic at where this is going. As with every new technology, I mean, you only have to look at where solar was 6-7 years ago here in the country and look at the amazing advancement and development, particularly in the regulation around it. I think we're going to see something similar with regards to EVs and EV infrastructure. So in the beginning, there's always a bit of, let's say, an unclarity regarding ownership structures, and you need a lot of engagement with federal and local level entities to try and understand who owns what, who regulates what, and what goes where. And I think where we were 2 years ago and where we are today, I think there's huge progress on this topic in particular.
Yeah. Anyone? Yeah? There's one there and then one there.
Quentin Wilson, I'm a motoring journalist from the UK and I've been driving electric cars for the last decade. I think there are a couple of learnings which the region could take from the UK's experience with electrification regarding demand on the network and cost. I speak to the National Grid quite regularly, and our offshore wind is pretty world leading. We've got 54 megawatts in the gigawatts in the pipeline now, which is more than China. We currently produce 10.5 gigawatts of offshore wind. And National Grid say that this, in the next 12 months, will be enough to power 80% of EV penetration. And the idea that the grid will fall over is very much an urban myth, which is being propagated by anti-EV lobbying groups. So the grid says that the UK is okay, and when you extrapolate it for the next 20 years, they're expecting 80% to 90% of the electricity in the grid to be completely renewable. So that's a learning here in this region with all the solar that you need to think very carefully about, to start building those renewables now to support a completely renewable electricity grid for your EVs. Controlling the cost and managing that peak demand seems to have worked in the UK. If I charge my electric car at that peak time of between 4 and 7 o'clock, I'm charged 36 pence per kilowatt hour. But if I charge it at the renewable time, which is 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock, it costs me 7.2 pence per kilowatt hour. So that's a huge difference and a fiscal reason that has made consumers change their behavior. In practice, very, very few electric car drivers ever charge at those peak times.
Thank you. That was a comment. Any question? Yeah, please.
Hello. So my question is very simple. We see EV adoption rising, EV infrastructure following, potentially some utility energy supply shortage. And how do we also place within that picture site selection? How do we make sure that in rural zone or urban zone we pick the right site? Today everybody is spreading sites all over. How do we make the right decisions? I'm keen to hear your thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak for the infrastructure side. And again, I think this goes back to the return on investment of whoever's placing these chargers, whoever's paying for this charging infrastructure, right? So if I'm going to be investing in a charging network which is placed in a rural area, then I would have to be aware of what kind of commercial return I'm getting, right? So if I would break even in 10, 11 years, then my investment backing might find this, let's say, not very attractive, right? So if it was more commercially attractive from a location perspective, then it would, let's say, make more sense. So I think location is always dependent on two key factors. A, the grid. Is the grid in that area able to handle it? So is there the right amount of energy? Do you need to upgrade? Do you need to install batteries, solar, etc.? And that, again, will increase your costs exponentially. And then what kind of returns are you going to make, right? So typically these are the two factors that go into a location.
Yeah, to give a practical example, I mean, take Europe. We have a European law to bring down the emissions, THG it's called. And if you own a vehicle and if you charge, you get $300 or $400 per annum. And so it's a law, and it's at the end of the day, the government and the country needs to set the boundary conditions and the direction, and then normally infrastructure and the things follow. But if you do not set a direction, I mean, it's all up to the end customer, and as we know, this is not the way how it works.
And just add to the whole thing, I mean, we talked about charging or not charging. Energy will cost money eventually. In the moment, it may be free in certain places, but it cannot be made for free, right? I mean, it's not.
Absolutely.
There's
It's not free, right?
Yeah, but it's taxed. And the problem is, how do you tax it? How do you steer it? And at the end of the day, renewable is not available 24 hours. Normally not.
That's true, but coming into rural places like you have urbanization and so on. So there's a market where the government cannot step in quick enough to have a solution for it. So there's also an opportunity for investors or for, let's say, local industry to bridge the gap from the decision of a government to build the grid till it's ready, and then to say, okay, now we dig the next 4 years, and then we hand it over whatsoever.
Yes, but we have to differentiate. In Europe, for instance, Miriam, we have one-phase countries like the UK, and you pointed out that the heat pump is coming, and this is for a one-phase grid a challenge. But we also have countries like Germany and Switzerland. We have a strong three-phase grid. They are better conditioned, yeah. But in general, we have a topic that the grid also needs to adapt to the number of cars, yeah. And especially in DC charging and urban charging. Yeah? But in Germany, people complained a lot, but there are thousands of DC chargers, and especially utility, they took the chance to install the Siemens transformers and to, let's say, to secure this business. Yeah? So it's opportunity makes business. Yeah?
Yep.
So I think if you think about the rural economy, you've got the opportunity there to use static storage actually at the point of generation. So if you've got solar and wind being generated in rural environments, keep some of that back, keep that in static storage, don't put it out to the out to the wider grid. And then you've got the opportunity, and someone mentioned tax a minute ago, which is very significant because for most governments, a significant portion of their revenue comes through fuel duty. Certainly the UK, where we're paying $5, not $1 a litre, most of which is tax, they're going to lose that because you can't regulate the same way with electricity because it's so widely available. So they're going to have to switch to other models, probably around things like road pricing or even pricing the carbon embedment of the vehicles during manufacture. But in the rural economy, they have a thing called red diesel in the UK, which is a subsidised low tax fuel. So you've got another whole layer of problem there. How do you switch to vehicles which are going to work certainly at certain times of the year 24/7. Combine harvester in the harvesting season does not stop. The drivers just keep changing. The vehicle keeps churning because you've got to get the harvest in. You do not have time to stop and recharge that vehicle. So there you're talking about the need to then start thinking about rechangeable battery packs. So it's a piece of kit that sits around, for 11 months of the year doing nothing, and for the 1 month of the year it works 24/7, 7 days a week. Yeah. So you've got challenges like that to start to think about as well.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, one last question. Maybe there are two. I was thinking maybe we should get back on track, but let's go. Unless you want to take the whole time.
Hello, my name is Melanie. I'm from Economist Impact, a division of the Economist Group. I think there's a strong case for standardizing chargers. My question is, where is the most resistance for that coming from, and what can we do to address that?
Just quickly, before I give it to the panel, maybe it's first agreeing among the several industrial partners on what are those minimum technical requirements before we standardize. For me, that's really key. How do you agree? And if you wait a lot, you're hindering innovation.
I think the biggest problem right now to agree to things is the speed of agreeing on things. Yeah. Because there's so many parties involved now, and every day things happening. We talk about hydrogen, we talk about solar, we talk about battery, we talk about local storage. There's so many things going on. So you agree something today, tomorrow it has to be changed. So I think speed is the biggest problem right now, that you really can focus on making decisions.
Yeah, not much to add. I mean, I think we've seen, and I think the industry has learned, maybe also on the speed topic. If you look at the megawatt charging standard, which is being developed currently between a number of key players in the industry, I think it's a very good story of, let's say, a standard being developed early on with the right stakeholders sitting on.
We have a talk just right after this.
Oh, really? Okay. So
Yes.
Siemens is part of that
Good.
standard development. So, yeah. So I think standardization is an excellent story of different, even competitors coming together to create something for the future. So yeah, I think good thing there.
How do you make it fast? It's known to be a slow process. How do you make it fast?
I think if you look at this panel there, everybody is from a different area.
Yeah.
I think it's just working together and push.
But you have the answer. Look at Tesla. I mean, you just have to make it, yeah? And the train is out of the door, as the automotive guy says, yeah? The race is open, so there is no...
Catch up or you miss it.
Every car manufacturer will have to become electric. So it's a pressure coming along with the market itself.
I think we're very much at a tipping point. I mean, certainly the figures that we're seeing as a cell manufacturer in terms of demand, the last thing I'm worried about is whether we'll be able to sell our batteries, because the demand profiles a few years ago was something like that. Now the graph goes nearly vertical, and it's like this sort of glacial wall of demand sort of, coming towards it. The only, unlike a glacier, it's actually moving really quite quickly. And I think these things sort of start to gather a momentum. Yeah, we also, as a company, we go to the Goodwood Festival of Speed. We're one of the sponsors there. And last year, very significantly, there's lots of petrol vehicles whizzing around the track doing donuts and blowing up their tyres and things. And then when you went out the back, Supercar Avenue was literally, I tell you what, almost deserted. Electric Avenue was absolutely heaving with people because they're watching petrol cars, but they're looking at what the next car they're going to buy is on Electric Avenue. And this year we're also sponsoring that again, and it's bigger and bigger and bigger each year. And I think consumers are really now starting to think about that. And I think the other thing that will drive behaviours as well, certainly a lot of cars are bought on finance, they're bought on this PCP, personal contract plans. As we get closer and closer to that 2030 date in UK and Europe, where you're going to stop the sales of combustion vehicles, the finance companies will start writing down the residuals on those vehicles very, very hard. What's it going to be worth? Because they're the ones, when the vehicle gets handed back, have got the problem of selling it. Once those residuals start taking a nosedive, the electric vehicle, which the residuals are pretty good on, they're going to start becoming the cheaper one also to actually take onto a personal contract plan. This will become overwhelming. Be cheaper to own on a personal contract plan, cheaper to recharge and to run. That's game over. The demand just takes off.
But Miriam, one comment from my side. I mean, we are sitting in the UAE in Dubai. Nice, sun is shining. But coming back to Europe, end of this decade, we will have 30 million chargers, and the consolidation amongst the suppliers is already on. Mm-hmm. So it's not the question where we install the chargers or how much, it will be done. And the first million last year in Germany, nobody believed in. We will now install 2 million per annum. So Europe shows, and even the UK shows, that it's possible. And it will be done, so don't worry. Maybe here's a specific area, yeah? Here's full of oil and sun. But in Europe, it's already decided. And it's only who will be the one successful as a supplier. This is the main question. And how much cars can you bring out? Because batteries are missing. But the infrastructure itself, it's not the topic anymore.
Yeah.
I think there's still a role for some government push. I think, I've been looking at electric vehicles, that graph, for 10 years now. And every year so far it's kind of moved this way, except in Norway, of course, that we can learn from what Norway's done. And I mean, look, the Scandinavian tree huggers always set the example culturally. I appreciate that. But what the governments have done, particularly regionally around renewable energy, but we haven't talked about China, we haven't talked about India, we haven't talked about the US, we haven't talked about South America, I haven't talked about what happens when all of Africa wants cars.
Yeah.
I mean, so you really have a global issue around the electrification of the fleet, and I think you need to have different government structures in different countries, but you still need a push. Now in terms of renewable energy, we're well past that point.
Yeah.
It's the cheapest on earth. Renewable energy is the cheapest on earth, and that's been achieved a lot through the efforts locally here by Masdar and others, but it's and globally by China, the manufacturing, and by the banks. And you mentioned like the bankability of things. Well, now it's very easy to bank a solar project or wind project, and difficult for a coal project. And hopefully we'll get past that tipping point. But I still think that we have the next 3 to 5 years of where we need a significant government push, both in terms of incentives, in terms of the regulatory changes, in terms of the infrastructure to support that this is still critical to the electrification of the fleet. The next 3 to 5 years are going to need that government push, and then hopefully the ball will be all rolling downhill, and you won't need it anymore. But I don't think we're out of the push part yet.
I think that's really important, and you're absolutely right. I think the other thing as well, when you start talking about places like Africa, they need to sort of leapfrog the technology generation. The danger is, as first world decarbonises, we just end up dumping old fossil fuel technologies back into those places. They become cheaper, and then all that happens is the problem just moves down. And what we've really got to make sure is that they leap to renewable energy, they leap to microgrids, and they leap to a charging infrastructure that goes with it, and they just bypass the whole fossil fuel state. I mean, I read a report a few years ago when I was doing work in UK Gov, and it talked about what the carbon impact of everybody in the world having a fridge was, if it was fossil fuel powered. And it was just terrific. But you think about a fridge, it's a pretty basic human right to keep food fresh, yeah? And it's exactly the same problem we've got now. So while the Western world or first world countries are busy decarbonising, it doesn't work if what happens is you end up with carbon dumping into other places as they emerge in countries.
Thank you. To the gentleman on this side, apologies, I won't take the question, we're running out of time, but please do find the panel members during the break. So a quick summary of some of my key takeaways. The grid is not ready with the many interconnected elements, but we do not need to start complicated. We can start at home, like one of the participants mentioned. A dynamic tariff will help people move away from peak, and that helps, but also integrating PVs, maybe storage will also help. The regulatory environment needs revisiting, and this has been mentioned in several of the presentations those past 2 days. Standardizations are very important. They simplify things, they set a direction, they help scale up. And finally, I asked about the opportunities to manufacture here, but then the panel members made it obvious that it is much more bigger than just manufacturing and much more exciting. So thank you for that. Any last quick words from the panelists before we conclude? No?
Not really words, so thanks for arranging it, I guess.
Okay, perfect. So
I've got one. I'd be remiss to say it. You're very close to Masdar. If you want to come out and see it while you're visiting the Electric Vehicle Innovation Summit, it's well worth the visit to see what we're doing in terms of sustainability, but also in terms of transportation, electric vehicles, and autonomous as well.
So they can just take a taxi
They can
and go
just
there.
show up. Yep, just take a taxi.
Perfect.
And a hybrid one, preferably.
Or electric.
A hybrid taxi.
Or fully electric.
Or type electric on Kareem, yes. Hit the electric button on Kareem.
Perfect. Stephen, Peter, Rasso, Andreas, Karim, thank you so much for taking the time and sitting with us.
Anyway, thank you.
Great, thank you.